A good Tavach. Welcome to this special Motzei Shabbos edition of 30 Letters in 30 Days. And today is a very special day on the calendar in connection to the genesis of Igros Kodesh, the set of Sfarim, of books that we're studying from now. I think in earlier classes, the first class and the second class, I shared some of the background of what was happening in Tafshin Mem Zayin 1987 when the Rebbe initially informed those in the secretariat and in the library that this project would begin in earnest, and with the Rebbe's constant supervision and urging that it should happen expediently. I want to add some details today, and that is because today, what we call Tes Zayin Adar, the 16th day of the Hebrew month of Adar, which is the day after Shushan Purim, was the very day, this date, 35 years ago, in 1987, when the Rebbe turned to Rabbi Shalom Ber Levin from the library and said, we're starting a new project, and gave Rabbi Levin a bundle of facsimiles of, meaning the office copies of letters of Igros Kodesh, or the letters that would become the series known as Igros Kodesh. And the Rebbe included a note with various details saying that we should go through these letters, we should review them for publication purposes, that we should review them for privacy issues, which I mentioned in a previous lesson that was something that was involving Rabbi Simpson from the Secretariat to screen all the letters to protect the privacy of those to whom the letters were written. And one very important point that I've added, that this should all be done urgently, swiftly, as soon as possible. And think about the timeline we're talking about. We're talking about the 16th day of Adar, the day after Shushan Purim. The first printed, actual physically printed book of Volume 1 of Igros Kodesh were delivered to the Rebbe's desk on the day before his birthday. The Rebbe's birthday, Yud Aleph Nisan. So basically you're talking about 24 days, if I'm doing my math correctly. Just a little bit over 3 weeks. The entire project went from inception, or at least from anyone other than the Rebbe knowing the plans, the inception of the project, to actually delivering a published physical volume in 3 weeks. Absolutely amazing. And that was all because the Rebbe was urging the entire time that this is very important and has to be done swiftly. And the entire project was done like that. Every volume after volume, was pushed out as quickly as possible. I should also mention that the sponsor of the very first volume, of the first printing of the Igros, was a Chassid, an Askan, Reb Mendel Shem Tov. Now, Reb Mendel Shem Tov, well, it's interesting because this, let me just, a little personal background. I'm doing the 30 letters in 30 days as a series every single night because some people were telling me, well, you know, back when the Corona lockdown started, you did every single night a Shara B'Tochen class, which I did. That's true. And we went through the whole Shara B'Tochen, Baruch Hashem, till we finished. So they said, why can't you do the Rebbe's letters every night? I should mention that the Shara B'Tochen class also is connected to Mendel Shem Tov, because my entire impetus for doing the Shara B'Tochen class was a letter that the Rebbe wrote to Mendel Shem Tov telling him that he should learn Shara B'Tochen from Rabbeinu B'chayis Chavis Lavavis, and that would increase his B'Tochen. And he shouldn't just learn it one time, he should learn it several times. So the entire impetus for Shara B'Tochen is from Mendel Shem Tov. But I should mention that Mendel Shem Tov was the sponsor of the first printing of the first volume of the Igros. He heard that such a project was happening, and he immediately sent in his check to the Secretariat and said, I get dibs. And at first it wasn't clear that he was going to get dibs, but then things worked out, Baruch Hashem, that he did become the sponsor. And I want to mention that this booklet you see here has a sponsor as well. If you look on the inside back cover, Le'ili Nishmas, Reb Menachem Mendel, I should say Rav HaTomim, Reb Menachem Mendel, Alav Shalom, Ben Rav HaChassid, Rav HaTomim, Shadar, Reb Ben Tzion, Alav Shalom, Shem Tov. So Mendel Shem Tov's kids, his family, they sponsored this booklet, I guess continuing in his good path. So a little bit of hashgacha pratis there. And I hope that this enriches your learning of these letters and shows you some of the color, some of the background, and makes it more relevant to you. Okay, without further ado, let's jump into tonight's letter. Letter number 7. Wow, we're finishing a full week of learning. We started last week on Sunday night, and now we're coming to Motzei Shabbos, so we're completing a full week's cycle of learning. Tonight's letter, letter 7, is from Yud Aleph Mar Cheshvan Tavshin Tes Vav. That's the 11th day of Cheshvan, Brooklyn. Havosik v'chosid. Vasik v'chosid is an honorific title bestowed to somebody who's doing good stuff and who's getting stuff done. Ish Yirei Elakim, the God-fearing, Nichbod, the Nale, the honorable, the exalted, Oisik B'tzarchei Tzibur, the communal servant, the one who's involved in communal affairs, Mareinu Harav, Mordechai Sheyichya. Who is Mordechai? Baruch Mordechai from Purim. Yesterday was Shushan Purim. Yes, that's the first Mordechai. But this Mordechai is Rebbe Mordechai Rich, Olav Shalom, from Melbourne, Australia. Now, I never met Mordechai Rich, but what I did is, in anticipation of this letter, I spoke with Reb Mendel New of Melbourne, Australia. May he be well. And he was there at the time. He was a very close friend of Mr. Rich, and he was part of all of the Rebbe is going to be speaking to Mr. Rich about the goings on at the Mossad known as Yeshiva College, the Mossad Chinuch, the educational institute that was founded by Lubavitch in Melbourne. And Mr. New was very, very involved in this from the very beginning, from its inception, and he was right there alongside with Mr. Rich, and I was able to get some incredible information from Mr. New. It's a lange Yoren, and in good health with much nachas from all of his family. Here's what I found out. First of all, very interesting personal connection. Mr. Rich's shidduch was made by Mr. New's parents. What's the story about that? Mr. Rich, Mordechai Rich, came from Europe after the war. He was a survivor, as were most of the Jews in Melbourne at that time. And at first he went to South Africa. And from South Africa, he came to Australia and he settled in Melbourne. And he was single. And the Mendel New's parents said to Mr. Rich, how would you like to meet a nice Jewish girl? He said, tell me about her. So they said, her parents run a fruit store in a non-Jewish neighborhood, and so they're open on Shabbos. But they have a daughter, and the girl, this daughter, she won't work on Shabbos. She's very frum, and she won't work in her parents' fruit store, even though it's open on Shabbos, and the family works in the store, but she won't work on Shabbos. So Mr. Rich said, let me meet her. And in 3 days, they were engaged to be married. So yes, that's a little bit about Mr. Rich. Apparently, he was a big guy, physically tall, big guy with a golden heart, a loving person who was always involved in tzedakah and kindness. He was not from the Lubavitcher community or from any type of Lubavitcher background. He was from a Mizrahi background. That was the movement with which he affiliated himself, and he was very involved with the Mizrahi movement all of the years in Melbourne. In fact, later I believe he was involved in a later school, also a religious Jewish school that started in Melbourne called Yavne. But at this point, he was involved in the founding of the Lubavitcher school. I'll just tell you one quick story more about Mr. Rich that I found out from Mr. New, which is just a beautiful story. Mr. Rich started a business, a factory making women's coats. And it was a rather lucrative business. And somebody wanted to buy it from him. Another Jew wanted to buy it from him. And I don't know the name of this other Jew. Mr. New mentioned that this prospective buyer was not Shomer Shabbos. In fact, that's the whole point of the story. He was not religious and did not keep Shabbos. Also, for whatever it's worth, it's interesting to note that he was a little person. He was a very, very short. He was a small person physically. And he was Jewish and he wasn't Shabbos observant. So this fellow, I don't know his name, wanted to buy the coat business from Mr. Rich. Mr. Rich said, I'll only sell you my business if you'll continue being Shomer Shabbos, meaning I'm Shomer Shabbos, my business is Shomer Shabbos, you're not Shomer Shabbos, but if you buy my business, I want the business to be Shomer Shabbos. And this fellow said, okay, I'll do it. And he became, from buying the business, he became Shabbos observant. Wonderful story. At any rate, so I hope that gives you a little bit of an insight into who this Mr. Rich was, and this should all be a schus for him. His neshama should have an aliyah. Okay. Shalom avracha, greetings and blessings. This letter is in Yiddish. Ich hab bekommen einen Brief. I received your letter on datum von schreiben. That is undated. You didn't put the date on the letter. I think I've mentioned this before. We take for granted that all letters are dated because we send each other emails and it just has a timestamp on it. And you see the email thread and you can see which email is a response to which. And these days, especially, remember, a letter going to Australia, I don't know how long it took to get there and to get back. Could be weeks. I'm not sure the time frame. But at any rate, when you have letters going back and forth and taking a long time, it's very helpful to indicate which date of which letter I'm responding to right now. So that's why the Rebbe mentions here, you didn't put a date on the letter. Und ich bin gewend zufrieden, leinen in hem. I was happy to read in your letter, as heupt sich an zu beteiligen energisch in the Inyanim von Yeshiva College Yitzchak Lubavitch in Melbourne, that you started to energetically take part in the work of the school called Ohale Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch, that was named in memory of the previous Rebbe, whose name was Yosef Yitzchak. I think I should mention a little history, that Lubavitch started a cheder, a school, before this. I believe in Tafshin Yud, and I believe that was founded by Zalman Serebransky. And it was a very small school. I think it had 3 children when they started, and it was just meant for Lubavitchers, and it was a Lubavitcher chinuch. And then later, a few years later, meaning around the time of the writing of this letter, they opened it under a new name, Ohale Yosef Yitzchak, and it was a community school, meaning it was meant for everyone, not just for Lubavitchers. And this is the Mossad known as Yeshiva College, which is a K through 12 institution till this day, and received through the years much direct guidance from the Rebbe. And in fact, there are many letters in the Igros to Mr. Rich. As far as I can tell, at least 4 more letters over the next couple of years where the Rebbe was writing to Mr. Rich, and all of these letters involved the school in Melbourne. Okay, so I'm very happy that Rebbe says to hear that you're taking part in the school. Und hoffentlich, als das tan energisch in die nötige Hishtadlus wird bringen die Brache von Hashem Yisborach und Hatzlacha. And I hope that you're taking part energetically in the school, that this effort is going to bring blessings from Hashem, and it's going to bring success. This is a very seemingly minor detail, but I just think it's important to stop for a second and reflect what the Rebbe is saying. I'm hoping that you're taking part energetically in the school, that hishtadlus, that effort, will bring Hashem's blessings for success. See, even here, the Rebbe is spelling it out very clearly, the mechanics of success. We have to do our part. We have to put forth effort. And in fact, energetically, and the more energetically we take part, the more of a vessel we create. But in the end, it's not our energy, it's not our efforts which produce success. It merely creates a vessel within which blessings from Hashem come down and translate into success. So I just think that's an important thing to remember about everything in life. Okay. Now that Rebbe speaks a little bit specifically about schools and education in our era, I think this is fascinating. Und in alle Zeiten und in alle Erter hat man gemusst haben a Torah Center von Torah, welche ist verbunden mit ihrer Shemaim. Now, if it is true that in all times and in all places it was important to have a Torah Center, to teach Torah and to transmit fear of heaven, Allah has come overcome, so much more so. This was true all along. Historically, this was important. But today, in our present time, it's even more important. In unserer Zeit, in our day, und in a Ort, and in such a place, meaning Melbourne, in such a place, and the Rebbe describes what he means by such a place, wo der jüdische Yishuv haupt an zu wachsen, where the Jewish settlement is growing. starting to grow. So to me, it was very important to note that the Rebbe is speaking here positively. It's a positive thing that the Jewish population of Melbourne is growing. So as the community grows, the needs are growing, and we got to keep up with those needs. So if it was always important historically to have a Torah Center that was disseminating Torah learning and teaching fear of heaven, how much more so in our time and in such a place like Melbourne, which is growing. Muzman legen auf dem die größte keuches. We have to put into it the greatest effort and let's call it energy. Und einkritzen gut in Kopf und Herz. We have to engrave well in our mind and in our heart the Maimer Azal, the saying of our sages, Kol Makayim Nefesh Achas Mi Yisrael, anyone who saves one Jewish life, Ki Ilu Kiyam Elam Malay, it is if he saved an entire world. In other words, you're creating an institution, but the institution isn't this monolith. It's not this machine. Ultimately, what's it about? The individual. If you can save one individual, you save the world. And that's how the Rebbe is telling Mr. Rich to set it up. Okay, now further insights about education in our era. Amol is a cheder und yeshiva für a kind, hat das abgeratet von zu sein in am Oretz. Once upon a time, the role of the yeshiva was to rescue a child from being an ignoramus. If he wouldn't have a yeshiva to go to, he'd be an ignoramus. Und hat dem gemacht, für a jedea Sefer, und größer Teil von die Kinder euch verleumden. And the child having the benefit of going to school, so it would save him from being an ignoramus, and it would make him someone who's knowledgeable of Judaism, at least rudimentary Judaism, or oftentimes it would make children into real scholars. And that was the purpose of a school, to produce Jewish scholarship. Aber in unserer Zeit, leider, unfortunately, however, in our time, and now the Rebbe is going to acknowledge some of the challenges of our day. Darf men trachten wegen opraten van Kinder, as they sollen bleiben Jiden. We have to actually think about saving children that they should remain Jewish. Meaning, in previous generations, the purpose of the school was to save them from being ignorant. But they would still remain Jewishly observant. Even someone who is totally ignorant would remain in the fold. For the most part, that's just the way life was among Jews. Today, though, the school's purpose has changed. And it's not to save him from being ignorant. It's to save him from completely, God forbid, leaving the fold and leaving Judaism. Und in dem kennt man sich nicht verlassen auf der Sviva und so weiter. And for this purpose, we cannot rely on the environment and such. Meaning to say, it's implied here, that once upon a time, the environment itself was enough. A kid's growing up in the shtetl. Okay, so if he doesn't go to cheder, he'll be an amoritz, he'll be ignorant. But he'll remain observant because Jewish observance is in the air. It's all around him. The sviva, the environment itself, will be sufficient to keep him Jewishly involved, even if he doesn't know how to learn, even if he's not a scholar. The Rebbe says is different today. The purpose of the school isn't to make sure that a child is a scholar. The purpose of the school is to make sure that he remains within Judaism. It's a very interesting distinction about how our time is different. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind today. I think sometimes schools forget what their purpose is, and they think it's to produce scholars. Well, that's nice to also produce scholars, but the primary purpose of schools today is to keep children involved in Judaism. Okay, Norman muss bauen für sie Festungen. We have to build fortresses for them, because the environment not only doesn't promote that they stay within Judaism, but the Rebbe doesn't say it explicitly, but that's the implication of building a fortress. The environment can take them away, God forbid. So we have to build fortresses. A cheder, a yeshiva, a school, v'chagibin die Garantie, that gives a guarantee, as they sollen bleiben Jiden, that they should remain Jewish, und die Ariches in them, is gewiss übrig. It is certainly superfluous to elaborate further on this point, meaning it's obvious. Okay. Now we're going to change to another subject that is a response to something specifically Mr. Rich had asked about. In Ihrer Frage, von welcher Schicht zu ziehen in dem Finanzkomitee, welche wird aufgestellt auf zu aushalten und ausbreiteren die Yeshiva. In response to your questions about the direction, the financial committee, the committee that was set up to support and expand the yeshiva, you want to know what should influence their actions. In other words, this is a new organization, a new institution, and Mr. Rich is asking for guidance about the direction, the spirit, the personality, so to speak, that the school should build for itself on an institutional level. Okay. Says the Rebbe, wendet sich das an dem Charakter und Fähigkeit von jeder Betreffenden besonder. See, this is a question that doesn't have a general answer because it depends on the character and the abilities of every member of the committee individually. Und die Rebbe ist schwer zu geben eine Antwort auf dem. Therefore, it's difficult to answer such a question. In other words, there's not a one-size-fits-all response to this. Allgemeine Antwort, however, a general answer that you could apply to most cases, and this is something you see with the Rebbe often, where the Rebbe will say, look, a specific answer is going to be different for everyone, and I can't do that right now, but what I can do is I can give you some general ground rules. So here's a general ground rule, and I think this is fascinating. Okay, so a general answer, aber, was man darf is, something general which we need. Euch hätten sich von zu geben der Yeshiva a politische Farbe. You should guard yourself. You should be vigilant not to give the school a political color, oder a parteiische Charakter, or a partisan characteristic. And as I mentioned to you, Mr. Rich was very involved in the Mizrahi community and movement. He himself was very involved in Zionism, and Zionism was very strong in Melbourne at that time, to the extent where basically anyone who was in the public eye in the Jewish community was Zionistic to some extent. And this is clearly what the Rebbe is speaking about, that it is a political or partisan issue, and you have to make sure that it doesn't become part of the yeshiva's identity. Very interesting, and the Rebbe explains why. And I should also mention that as much as you're going to see the Rebbe speaking here about making sure not to allow the school to take on a Zionistic flavor, I think the Lubavitcher Rebbe's record as far as supporting the Jews living in Israel and the security of Israel and the military and the government, and making sure that there is safety and security and prosperity for every Jew in the Holy Land is beyond reproach. We all know, and if you don't know, it's something to study, the Rebbe's position on a strong government and military in the land of Israel. However, that is very different than taking on what the Rebbe describes as political leanings. And I think we can extrapolate, if I can humbly suggest, that this doesn't just apply to Zionism, but to any political issue. It's interesting also because in the 50s, Zionism was considered more of a left-wing issue. And now today it's more, for the most part, considered more right-wing. So you see how these political things are they change with the times. They're political trends. And like the word trend implies, these things are not set in stone. They're not toidos emes. They're not something that's eternal. They're fluid. And I think that's part of what the Rebbe is saying here is let's try to stay above these political leanings, which are going to change and fluctuate. And the Rebbe says also very specifically how political leanings will estrange people that you're trying to help. That's what the Rebbe says explicitly. So let's see what the Rebbe actually says, and I'll reserve any more of my commentary for never. I'm going to try not to give any more of my own observations for the rest of this letter. Let's just get through it because we're running short on time as well. Weil das Lernen Torah ist nicht verbunden mit Politik und Partei. Strong statement from the Rebbe. Learning Torah is not connected to politics and it's not connected to parties. This is not my commentary. I said I'm refraining from it, but a story. When the communists came to arrest the Frierdiker Rebbe, and they came to his house to arrest him in the middle of the night, they asked his daughters, one of them the Rebbe's wife, Rebbe Tzimchaya Mushka, what party do you belong to? And if you know anything about communist Russia, especially when the KGB themselves were coming to your house with a warrant for arrest, you didn't start up with them. And they asked the question, what party do you belong to? It's pretty clear what the question was demanding. They wanted the daughters of the Frierdiker Rebbe to say that they are members of the Communist Party. And it's very interesting. It's recorded in the Frierdiker Rebbe's journal of his arrest and liberation. Frierdiker Rebbe's daughters said that we belong to our father's party. We belong to our father's party. And I think that's something that every chassid should at least aspire to. If you ask me what party, what movement am I loyal to? I'm loyal to the Rebbe's party. Just something to consider. Okay, so the Rebbe says Torah study is not connected to politics or party. Was das is gewen einer von die Yesedis von der Atzlocha von Lubavitcher Meistes. The Rebbe says, just to let you know, one of the reasons why Lubavitch has been successful, why this, and this is 1955. Think about in our day, the growth of the Lubavitcher institutions. The Rebbe says one of the reasons that the Lubavitcher Meistes, that means the Lubavitcher institutions, have been so successful is because we avoid politics. Was sie seinen ständig gewesen, überparteiisch. I love that Yiddish word. They've always remained überparteiisch. They've remained transcendent of partisanship. I think that's, wow, this is written in 1955, but in 2022, I think this is something to take to heart. Lubavitcher Meistes are successful because they transcend and remain above partisanship. Und wenn man tracht sich herein in dem tiefen Sinn von dem, when you think deeply about the deepest sense of what this means, als die Teure ist gegeben geworden, einseitig zu alle Shishim Ribbel Yidden. Torah was given at once to all 600,000 Jews. It's interesting. We take that for granted. Why wasn't there like some breakout sessions or something? Like this Shevet would get the Torah over here and that Shevet would get the Torah over there. Or maybe even, because Torah is something you learn, so we'd have like the advanced students getting the Torah over in one room and the slower students getting the Torah over in another room. Yeah, why not? Why not break it up? No, everyone got the Torah at the same time. Von dem Gadol shebegedelim, bis dem Kotten shebeketanim, from the greatest of the great to the smallest of the small. Und wie alle haben einseitig gehört die Dibros, and they all simultaneously heard the commandments. So first of all, Torah doesn't look at partisanship or different leanings. Torah is one Torah for all Jews. That's one point. Furthermore, they all heard all of the commandments. And this is very geschmack. It's not, I'm just going to give you a little preview. It's not that those who are more inclined to social justice mitzvahs, they heard Leisachmai, don't covet your neighbor. And those who are more into religious observance and ritual, they heard to keep Shabbos. No, everybody, regardless of if you're more into Ben Adam L'Chaveda, more into Ben Adam L'Mokim, whether you're into the social justice mitzvahs or you're more into the ritual observance mitzvahs, they all heard all of them at the same time. Okay, let's look inside. That they all heard the Seres Adibros, the 10 Commandments, at the same time. Anoich Hashem Elokecha, I'm the Lord your God. Zachar Yom Shabbos, remember the Sabbath day. V'lo Isachmai, that's the last one. The 10th one, do not covet. Begreif men dem inyan. So from this you can grasp As Torah is for alle Yidden. The Torah is for all Jews, all kinds of Jews. Und von Anochi Hashem Elokecha muss man zukommen, nicht nur zu Zachris Yom Shabbos, nur euch zu Leisachmeid. That from Anochi, meaning I am the Lord your God, basic belief in monotheism, that belief has to lead not only to Shabbos observance, but also to do not covet. In other words, the belief in God cannot just manifest itself in ritual observance like Shabbos observance, but it has to also translate into social justice mitzvahs like do not covet. And now the flip side, kann man sich nicht aushitten von der Leisachmeid, ob es ist nicht begründet auf Anochi Hashem Elokecha und ob man legt nicht alle Keuches zu ausfolgendem Zacharis Yom Shabbos. Conversely, you cannot properly commit yourself to the social justice mitzvahs like do not covet if you don't base that mitzvah on a belief in God and on the observance of Shabbos. You cannot have one without the other. You can't cut out the Bein Adam L'Chaveda and allow just the Bein Adam L'Makim, but conversely, you can't cut out the Bein Adam L'Makim and just keep the social justice mitzvahs. You have to have both. So the entire Torah was given to all types of Jews all at once. This tells us a couple things. First of all, it's for all Jews. Second of all, Torah has to encompass all kinds of mitzvahs that appeal to all kinds of Jews with all kinds of leanings. So here's what the Rebbe says. Und der Rebbe darf man da nicht reinmischen kein seitige Inyanim. Therefore, because of this, it's very important not to mix in any side stuff. Don't mix in anything else. Anything with, the Rebbe calls it Zeitek and Yonim, side stuff. Was amol schreckt man sich ab von dem Zeitek Inyan. Sometimes people get scared off by the side stuff. That's not even your mission. Your mission was to teach Torah and Yiras Shamayim. But you took on an extra character that really isn't part of your mission, and that character is going to scare people off. Because you're going to say, well, some people like it. Yeah, some people do like it, but others don't like it. And your job isn't to be partisan and to please those who like that and then turn off those who don't like it. Your job is to stick with Torah and appeal to everyone. Now, if there are people who are turned off by Torah itself, okay, that's a different question. That's a different question, which you can go into in another time. But we're saying don't add anything extra that could turn off one kind of person or another kind of person, because you know what you're risking here? You're risking that this person is going to lose out on Yiddishkeit. And can you really take responsibility for that? You turned someone away from Yiddishkeit because you wanted to give the yeshiva a certain character that's going to push away some people? And that character is not even part of your mission statement? The Rebbe says it clear here. Tzidas is partei oder Politik, whether that's something that's partisan or political. Und man verliert durch dem die Gelegenheit zu verbinden sich mit der Teures Chaim und Mitzvei Seha. Whether it's a political thing or a partisan thing, by pushing that thing that the person's afraid of, you lose the opportunity for that person to connect themselves to Torah and mitzvahs. Was it worth it? No, says the Rebbe. Wasn't worth it. Don't do it. Okay. Let's finish up here. Gewiss gedenkt ihr unser Gespräch. Certainly you remember our conversation. Und ich hoffe, als es ist übrig zu wiederhallen, beten und erwecken euch aufzutun in die Unionen von der Yeshiva alle Yesef Yitzchak, leut eure alle Möglichkeiten und ausnutzen eure Hashpah. Let's turn the page. Das Maximum in them. It is, I hope that you remember our conversation, and it's unnecessary to continue re-questioning of you, to toil in the matters of the Yeshiva Ola Yesef Yitzchak according to your abilities, using your fullest influence to the maximum. So why am I even mentioning it here? This is a great close. So why am I even mentioning here to remind you about putting forth your energy and being involved in the yeshiva? The Rebbe says, "Unor leiten meimer azal." I'm only doing this in accordance with the saying of our sages. Ein mizorazen ele lemizurazen. You only urge on, you only push those who already possess alacrity. It's like a double expression. Ein mazarazin ele lemizurazen. It means that if somebody isn't on top of things, so you don't even bother to remind them. But someone who's on top of things already, you just give them an extra oomph. So that's what the Rebbe is saying. I'm not suspecting that you're not into it. I think you are into it. But there's a saying of our sages, people who are already into something, you give them an extra push. Encourage the enthusiastic. By the way, the Rebbe said this thousands of times. If you count not just the Igros, but the Rebbe's Sichos, that ein mazazen ella l'muzurazen, that you encourage the enthusiastic. Somebody who's already into something, you just keep on giving them more and more and more good energy. Keep feeding the flame. Okay. Will ich noch einmal ma'orer sein eich in dem, so I want to just one more time urge you on, kedei es soll zukommen in eire Arbeit, so it should become part of your activities. Birkas hatzlocha b'chol now, with blessings for success in all of the above, and in eire inyanim aprotim, also in your personal affairs. I'm giving you a bracha. Hamachake b'suras teves. I await good news, and that is tonight's letter. Thank you so much for joining us.